The problem with having hearing sensitive enough to detect a mouse sneezing 3 levels down was that the morning rush at Nebula Brew sounded less like a coffee shop and more like a shuttle engine exploding inside a tin can. Betty twitched her left ear, a triangular tuft of cream-colored fur that swiveled independently of her right one, trying to filter out the cacophony. The espresso machine screamed as it purged steam. A group of Lithovore's rock people, who tipped terribly, were grinding their teeth near the window, a sound akin to tectonic plates shifting. And Rook, her four-armed pastry chef, was currently juggling 3 trays of glowing pastries, while humming a tune that was entirely off-key. "Order up," Betty muttered, sliding a tall glass across the counter. The liquid inside was a violently purple hue, swirling with suspended edible glitter. "Stardust macchiato extra methane foam. Don't drink it too fast or you will float. Literally." The customer, a slug-like creature with 3 eye stalks, burbled a thank you and slithered away, leaving a trail of slime that the cleaning drones would have to deal with later. Betty sighed, leaning her elbows on the counter. Her tail, a long, expressive appendage covered in the same cream and coffee fur as the rest of her, gave an irritated flick. She caught her reflection in the polished chrome of the espresso machine. Vertical slit pupils, whiskers that were currently drooping with exhaustion, and a name tag that read, "Betty, Manager." If only they knew. If only the Slugman or the Rock People or the pretentious high elves from the upper levels knew that the feline humanoid frothing their milk was actually the last heir to the Lumen Wardens. She was supposed to be a guardian of the ancient pact, a mystic warrior, capable of sensing the energy flow that kept Celestia Harbor suspended in the clouds. Instead, she was worried about running out of oat milk. "You look like you are plotting a murder," Rook said, leaning over the counter. He used his upper set of arms to wipe down a surface, while his lower set kneaded dough with rhythmic precision. "Is it the Lithovores? I can tell them to leave. I will tell them we ran out of rocks." "I am not plotting a murder, Rook. I am plotting a nap," Betty corrected, grabbing a cloth to wipe a spill. "And do not antagonize the customers. We need the credits. The rent on this place went up 5% last month," Rook scoffed. "Rent. A primitive concept. In my homeworld we live in communal hives." "Well, welcome to Celestia Harbor," Betty said dryly. "Where gravity is artificial, but the debt is very real." She turned to look out the panoramic window behind the bar. It was the only reason she tolerated the rent. From here on, the mid-levels of the vertical city, the view was breathtaking. Celestia Harbor was a miracle of engineering, a massive spire of metal and glass, piercing the sky, held aloft by the hum of the Lumen Core. Outside, the traffic of 1,000 worlds flowed like a river of light. Personal shuttles, cargo haulers, and massive interstellar freighters navigated the invisible flight paths, docking at the various rings of the city. The sun was rising, painting the clouds beneath them in shades of gold and violet. It was beautiful. It was fragile. And lately, it felt wrong. Betty suppressed a shiver. It wasn't a chill in the air. The climate control was set to a perfect 22 degrees. It was a vibration in her bones, a subtle dissonance in the song of the city. The Lumen Core, the massive energy source housed in the restricted lower sectors, was skipping beats. Most people couldn't feel it. To them, the ground was solid. To Betty, whose bloodline was tied to the core's frequency, it felt like walking on a tightrope that was slowly unraveling. "Focus, Betty," she whispered to herself. "Latte art first, existential dread later." The bell above the door chimed a cheerful digital tone that cut through the noise. Betty didn't need to look up to know who it was. She could smell the distinct scent of engine grease, ozone, and cheap laundry detergent. "Morning, Betty," a child's voice rang out. Betty's whiskers perked up involuntarily. She adopted her best look of disinterested boredom before turning around. "We are closed," she deadpanned. Standing in the doorway was a human male, tall and broad-shouldered, looking like he had slept in his flight suit for 3 days straight. His hair was a mess of dark waves, and there were grease smudges on his cheek that matched the worn leather of his jacket. Beside him, bouncing on the balls of her feet, was a girl of about 10 years old. She had her father's dark hair, but her skin had a faint, iridescent shimmer, the mark of her mother's alien heritage. Jim and Mira. Closed, Jim asked, blinking his tired brown eyes. He checked his wrist chrono. But the sign says open, and there are people in here, and I see coffee. Optical illusion, Betty said, reaching for a clean mug anyway. A mass hallucination induced by altitude sickness. Mira giggled, rushing forward to hop onto one of the spinning bar stools. She is lying, Dad. She is making her tail do the happy twitch. Betty immediately stiffened her tail. I do not have a happy twitch. That was a spasm. I need magnesium. Jim walked up to the counter, offering a smile that was equal parts apologetic and charming. It was the kind of smile that probably got him out of parking tickets and customs violations. Sorry to crash the hallucination, Betty. Just got back from a run to the asteroid belt. Long haul. The autopilot on the rusty Starling is acting up again, so I had to fly manual for the last 6 hours. You need a new ship, Jim, Betty said, starting his order without him having to ask. A double-shot black coffee, strong enough to wake the dead. That bucket of bolts is going to fall out of the sky one day. She is not a bucket, Jim defended, though he looked like he might fall asleep standing up. She has character. Besides, with the docking fees in this city, who can afford a new ship? I want the foamy thing, Mira interrupted, slamming her small hands on the counter. Please, Betty. The one with the bubbles that pop in your nose. Sparkle Fizz Lemonade, Betty corrected, though her tone softened. She liked the kid. Mira was one of the few people in Celestia Harbor who didn't look at Betty and see servant or mysterious feline. She just saw a friend with fur. And fine, but if you get hyper and crash into a wall, I am not liable. As Betty worked her hands moving with the fluid grace of her species, she noticed the shift in the room. It was subtle, but palpable. The lithivores had stopped grinding their teeth. The slugman was staring. A table of avian merchants fell silent. Eyes were on Jim. Celestia Harbor prided itself on being a melting pot of the galaxy, a beacon of the interspecies concord. But old prejudices died hard. Humans were latecomers to the galactic stage. They were viewed by many elder races as volatile, aggressive, and dangerously unpredictable. Deathworlders, they called them creatures, evolved on a planet with high-gravity chaotic weather and a history of war. Jim seemed used to the stares. He hunched his shoulders slightly, making himself look smaller, keeping his eyes on Mira. He was trying to be invisible. Here, Betty said loudly, slamming Jim's coffee down with more force than necessary. The noise made the avian merchants jump and look away. Drink. You look like a zombie that has been reanimated by a discount necromancer. Jim took a grateful sip, sighing as the caffeine hit his system. You are a lifesaver, Betty. Truly. I think my blood was 90% cortisol before this. Only 90, you are improving, she teased. She slid the bubbling pink drink to Mira. So, how was the haul? Did you manage to transport the cargo without blowing anything up? Ha. Very funny, Jim wiped foam from his lip. It was boring, just mining equipment. Though getting clearance to dock was a nightmare. The Port Authority is tightening security again. They kept scanning my ship like I was smuggling dark matter. I heard the rumors, Rook chimed in, sliding a plate of pastries toward Mira. Counselor Arden Morell is pushing for stricter regulations on non-conquered vessels. He says it is for safety. At the mention of the name, Betty's ears flattened against her skull. Arden Morell. The Glessari politician was slicker than the oil on a shuttle deck. He was beautiful in a terrifying way, with skin like translucent crystal that showed the shifting lights of his nervous system beneath. He spoke of unity, but his policies always seemed to put humans and other newer species at the back of the line. It is not just safety, a voice rumbled from a nearby table. A large reptilian docker was glaring at Jim. The core has been unstable. They say it is the resonance from the primitive engines these humans use. Disruptors, all of them. Jim stiffened. He set his cup down, his hand trembling slightly. My engines are standard fusion drives, he said, his voice low. Same as yours. Your kind brings chaos, the reptile spat. You should not be in the harbor. You belong on the ground in the dirt. Mira stopped drinking her lemonade. She looked from the reptile to her father, her eyes widening. Betty felt a surge of heat in her chest. It wasn't the anger of a barista defending a customer. It was the ancient burning instinct of a warden sensing a threat to the balance. The lumen energy beneath the floorboards pulsed in response to her emotion, a low thrum that rattled the teaspoons on the counter. She slammed a metal pitcher down. The sharp clang echoed through the shop, silencing the room instantly. Hey! Betty hissed, her voice dropping an octave, becoming guttural and dangerous. She fixed her vertical pupils on the reptilian docker. This is a coffee shop, not the council debate floor. If you want to talk politics, go to the upper levels. If you want to insult my customers, you can get out. And pay your tab before you go. I know you ordered 3 muffins. The reptile blinked, taken aback by the ferocity of the small, fluffy barista. He grumbled something under his breath, threw a few credit chips on the table, and lumbered out. The tension in the room dissipated, but the air remained heavy. Thanks, Jim murmured, staring into his coffee. You didn't have to do that. I did, Betty said aggressively, wiping the counter. He was ruining the vibe. Bad vibes curdle the milk. Jim offered a weak chuckle, but the light didn't reach his eyes. Maybe he is right, though. Maybe we don't belong up here. Mira, maybe I should look for a run on the surface. Or a station closer to Earth. No, Mira protested, her mouth covered in pink foam. I like it here. I like school. I like the gravity lifts. And I like Betty, Jim sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. I know, kiddo. I know. It is just complicated. He pulled out his datapad, a clunky, battered device that looked like it had survived a war. I need to check the cargo manifest for the next job. Captain Yara said she might have a slot for me, but I need to confirm the weight distribution before noon. He started tapping on the screen, his brow furrowed in concentration. Mira, bored by the talk of weight distribution, leaned over and snatched the device from his hands. Hey, Jim protested weakly. Mira, give that back. Dad is working. You are always working, Mira complained, scrolling through the screen with the speed of a digital native. You need to have fun. You have 0 notifications. That is sad, Dad. Even the cleaning drones have social profiles. I have a profile, Jim muttered, taking another sip of coffee. I just don't use it. Who am I going to talk to the nav computer? You need friends, Mira declared. She tapped an icon. The holographic interface of Citizen Link, the city's internal network, hovered in the air between them. It was a mesh of blue light connecting the millions of souls in Celestia Harbor. Betty watched, amused, as she rinsed a blender. She is right, Jim. Your social life is tragic. Last week you told me your best friend was a wrench. It is a very good wrench, Jim defended. It has torque settings you wouldn't believe. Mira was scrolling through the local proximity list. Her eyes lit up. Look, Betty is on here. Betty froze. I am... Yeah, Betty, Nebula Brew Manager. Profile picture is a cup of coffee. Mira wrinkled her nose. Boring. I am sending a request. Mira, don't, Jim said, reaching for the pad. Betty is working. She doesn't want to be spam tagged in your dad's boring logistics updates. Too late, Mira chirped. She pressed a button on the screen. And I added a sticker. The one with the cat making a heart shape with its paws. Because you know, Betty is a cat. I am a Faliri, Betty corrected automatically, though she couldn't suppress a smirk. There is a distinction. Cats walk on 4 legs and don't pay taxes. I walk on 2 and owe the city government 30% of my income. A soft ping sounded from the terminal built into the counter. Betty looked down. There on her private screen was a notification box pulsing in a cheerful blue. Friend request received user James Jim Thorne. Pilot Class C message. Animated sticker. Heart cat. It was ridiculous. It was mundane. It was exactly the kind of trivial human nonsense that a Lumen warden sworn to solitude and secrecy, burdened by the weight of 1,000-year-old history, should ignore. Her ancestors would be rolling in their crypts. A warden, bonding with a human pilot, unthinkable. But Betty looked at Jim. He was rubbing the back of his neck, his face flushed with embarrassment. He looked so tired, so out of place, and yet so desperately trying to build a home for his daughter in a world that didn't want him. And Mira was grinning her eyes, full of innocent expectation. "Fine," Betty sighed. "But if you start sending me pictures of your wrench, I am blocking you." She extended a clawed finger and tapped accept. The moment her finger made contact with the screen, the world tilted. It wasn't a physical tilt. The coffee cups didn't slide. The customers didn't fall. But for Betty, it felt as if the gravity generator had suddenly reversed polarity. A shockwave, invisible and silent to everyone else, punched through her chest. It wasn't pain. It was a sudden, overwhelming rush of connection. Thrum. The sound was inside her head. It was the sound of a massive lock tumbling into place. Deep, deep below the floorboards, miles down in the mechanical heart of Celestia Harbor, the Lumen core surged. The lights in the cafe flickered violently. The holographic menu above the bar distorted the text, scrambling into ancient runic symbols, the language of the first builders, before snapping back to listing the price of a mocha. "Whoa," Rook said, looking up from his dough. "Power surge, did we forget to pay the electric bill too?" Betty gripped the counter, her knuckles turning white beneath her fur. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, beating in a rhythm that wasn't her own. It was a syncopated double beat. Thump, 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 thump. She looked at Jim. He hadn't felt the shockwave. He was just blinking at the flickering lights, looking confused. But for a split second, Betty saw him differently. The air around him seemed to shimmer, a faint golden aura, wrapping around his shoulders like a cloak. It was the color of raw Lumen energy. "Betty," Jim asked, noticing her expression. "You okay? You look like you saw a ghost, or whatever the Faliri equivalent of a ghost is. A vacuum cleaner." Betty forced herself to breathe. She shook her head, the golden aura fading from her vision. The sensation in the floorboards settled, but the humming of the city felt different now. It was louder, clearer, and it seemed to be pulling her toward the man sitting on the bar stool. "I am fine," she managed to say, though her voice sounded breathless to her own ears. "Just a glitch. Old wiring. This building is falling apart." "See," Mira said triumphantly, handing the datapad back to her father. "Nothing bad happened. Now you are friends. You have to like each other's posts. It is the law." "It is not the law, Gremlin," Jim said, ruffling her hair. He looked at Betty, offering an apologetic smile. "Sorry about the power flicker. Maybe my chaos energy is real after all." "Maybe," Betty said, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. What just happened? She had accepted friend requests before. She had a social profile. Why did this one feel like she had just plugged herself into a fusion reactor? Or maybe the universe just has a weird sense of humor. Outside the window on the pedestrian walkway that circled the mid-level ring, a figure paused. Arden Mirel stood perfectly still, the crowd of commuters parting around him, like water around a stone. His translucent skin caught the morning light, refracting it into a spectrum of rainbows. He wasn't looking at the view. He was looking through the glass of Nebula Brew, his gaze fixed on the digital screen above the counter where the glitch had occurred. He raised a hand, his long crystalline fingers tracing the air. He could feel it too, the ripple in the core. Someone had just accessed a pathway that had been dormant for 3 centuries. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. It distorted the light, passing through his cheeks, making his expression look fractured. "Interesting," he whispered. "Very interesting." Inside the shop, Jim checked his chrono again. "Shoot. We are going to be late for school, Mira. And I need to get to the docking bay." He slid off the stool, fishing in his pocket for credits. "Keep the change, Betty. Consider it a hazard pay for dealing with the friend request." "I will," Betty said, her hands still shaking slightly as she took the credits. "Drive safe, Jim. And fly manual. Don't trust the autopilot." "Always," Jim saluted playfully. "Come on, kiddo, let's go." Mira waved her other hand, gripping her father's firmly. "Bye, Betty by Rook." "Goodbye, small noisy human," Rook called out. Betty watched them go. She watched the glass door slide shut behind them, muting the sound of the city. She watched them merge into the crowd, Jim's tall figure stooping slightly to listen to something Mira was saying. She should have gone back to work. There were dishes to wash. The espresso machine needed to be flushed. But she couldn't move. She looked down at her own wrist terminal. The notification was still there. Friend status active. But underneath it, in a font so small, she almost missed it, a font that shouldn't exist on a standard CitizenLink interface, was a second line of text, pulsating, with a faint, golden glow. "Primary protocol initiated. Anchor located." Betty stared at the words. A cold dread pooled in her stomach, warring with that strange, warm hum of connection. "Anchor," she whispered. The Lumen Wardens had legends, stories told by grandmothers in hushed tones about the days when the city was built. They spoke of wardens who channeled the energy and anchors who grounded it. But those were myths. The anchors had disappeared centuries ago. The pact was broken. That was why the Faliri hid in plain sight, guarding a dying flame. She looked out the window again, searching for Jim's retreating figure. He was just a pilot. A tired single dad with a rusty ship and a bad wrench joke. There was no way he was part of the High Concordance. It was a mistake, a system error. "Betty!" Rook shouted, snapping her out of her trance. "The milk steamer is screaming again. Are you going to fix it, or are we making cappuccino soup?" Betty blinked, shaking her head to clear the static. "I am on it," she snapped back, grabbing a towel. She turned her back on the window. She turned her back on the cryptic message. She was just a barista. Today was just a Tuesday. And Jim was just a customer. But as she reached for the steam wand, the floor beneath her feet vibrated again, not a random shake, but a steady, rhythmic pulse. It matched the beating of her own heart. Thump thump. Somewhere deep in the city, the Lumen Core was waking up. And it seemed to think Betty had finally decided to go back to work. The shift dragged on for another 4 hours, but for Betty, it felt like a blur. Every time she poured a drink, she felt the liquid move before she tipped the pitcher. Every time the automatic door opened, she sensed the person entering 3 seconds before the sensor tripped. Her senses, usually sharp, were dialed up to a painful degree. She could hear the electricity buzzing in the wall sconces. She could smell the ozone from the atmospheric scrubbers on the upper level. By the time 2 o'clock rolled around, and her replacement, a hyperactive squirrel-like rodent named Pip, arrived, Betty felt like she had run a marathon. "You look terrible," Pip said cheerfully, tying on his apron. "Did you eat a bad mouse?" "I don't eat mice, Pip. I am a vegetarian, and I am tired," Betty grunted, untying her apron. "The shop is yours. If the machine starts hissing, hit it on the left side. If the lithivores come back, tell them we are out of gravel." She grabbed her bag and fled. The commute home to the lower residential ring usually took 20 minutes on the maglev train. Betty squeezed into a corner of the car, surrounded by a throng of workers ending their early shifts. There was a scentscape of sweat, industrial cleaner, and fried food. She closed her eyes, trying to meditate. Center the mind, ignore the noise. But she couldn't ignore the pull. It was a physical sensation, like a string tied around her ribcage, tugging her gently, but insistently, in a specific direction. She focused on the feeling tracing the invisible line. It led out of the train through the metal hull of the city and pointed up, toward the docking bays, toward where Jim would be prepping his ship. Betty opened her eyes, staring at the ceiling of the train car. The advertising screen above her was playing a loop for a new brand of synthetic detergent, but suddenly, the image flickered. For a tenth of a second, the smiling human housewife was replaced by a geometric diagram, a complex web of lines and nodes. One node was pulsing gold, the other was pulsing blue. They were moving closer together. "No," Betty whispered. "I accepted a friend request. I did not accept a destiny. I have bills to pay. I have a catnap schedule to maintain." The passenger next to her, a large, hairy creature reading a datapad, shifted away from her nervously. Betty pulled her jacket tighter around herself. She needed to go home. She needed to brew a pot of calming tea, lock her door, and delete her Citizen Link profile. That would fix it. Just delete the app. Unfriend the pilot. Reset the universe to its factory settings. But as the train banked around a curve, revealing the sprawling, glittering expanse of Celestia Harbor against the darkening sky, Betty felt a profound, terrifying certainty settle in her gut. The connection hadn't just opened a door. It had blown the hinges off. And somewhere in the shadows of the High Council Tower, she knew with the instinct of a hunter that had been dormant for too long that something was watching them. Something that had been waiting for this exact mistake. She looked down at her hand. Her fur was standing on end. A faint spark of golden light jumped from her thumb to her forefinger. "Oh, furballs," she cursed softly. The train rushed into the tunnel, plunging them into darkness, but the spark on her finger remained a tiny defiant star in the gloom. The game had begun, whether she wanted to play or not. The notification chimed at 3 o'clock in the morning. Betty was asleep, curled into a tight ball of cream-colored fur, and anxiety dreaming of a giant ball of yarn that was actually a black hole. When the sound cut through the silence of her apartment, her eyes snapped open. Her first instinct was to hiss. Her second instinct was to check the perimeter for intruders. Her third, and most rational instinct, was to grab her wrist terminal and throw it across the room. She refrained from the throwing mostly because the terminal was expensive. Instead, she squinted at the glowing holographic projection hovering above her wrist. Bonded Citizen Alert. Partner Status Update. James Thorne has elevated cortisol levels. Detected during REM cycle. Recommended action soothing vocalization or mutual grooming. "Mutual grooming," Betty whispered to the empty room, her voice thick with sleep. "I am going to find the programmer who wrote this algorithm, and I am going to sharpen my claws on their furniture." This had been happening for 3 days. Ever since the incident with the friend request, the Citizen Link system had decided that she and Jim Thorne were not just casual acquaintances, but some form of deep-linked biological pair. The system called it a bonded citizen channel, a feature usually reserved for married couples, business partners, or siblings who shared a genetic tracking marker. She swiped the notification away. Dismiss. Are you sure partner stress levels indicate a nightmare? Dismiss, Betty growled. I am not his therapy cat. The hologram flickered and vanished, leaving her in the dark. But the darkness was not empty. As Betty tried to settle back into her pillows, she could feel it, the phantom tug in her chest. It was faint, like a thread of spider silk pulled taut across a canyon, but it was there. She could feel a distant, echoing panic that did not belong to her. It tasted like smoke and ozone. It was Jim. He really was having a nightmare. Betty squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands over her ears, as if that could block out a psychic connection. She was a barista. She made latte art. She paid her taxes. She was not supposed to be lying awake at night, worrying about the emotional state of a human pilot she barely knew. Go to sleep, Jim, she murmured into the dark, projecting the thought with as much intent as she could muster. It is just a dream. The engine is not on fire. The landing gear is down. Sleep. Surprisingly, the tension in the invisible thread slackened. The panic faded, replaced by a slow, rhythmic thrumming that felt suspiciously like a heartbeat slowing down. Betty lay there staring at the ceiling, her own heart racing. She had just used a warden soothing technique. She had not used that since she was a kitten back before the accident, before she had sworn off everything related to the Lumen Core. Coincidence, she told herself. Just a coincidence. But as she drifted back into a restless sleep, the dreams came for her too. She was standing in a vast white void. The ground beneath her paws was not solid matter, but pure, solidified light. Above her, the sky was a swirling vortex of gold and violet energy, moving like a living oil painting. "The anchor is loose," a voice whispered. It sounded like grinding stones, ancient and heavy. The city lists. The heart stutters. Find the weight to hold the line. Betty tried to run, but her legs were heavy, dragging through the light as if it were molasses. She saw a figure in the distance, a silhouette of a man standing on the edge of a precipice. The wind was tearing at his clothes. He was holding something, a rope, a cable, a lifeline, and he was slipping. "Jim!" she screamed, though she did not know why she called his name. The figure turned. It was him, but his eyes were glowing with the same golden light as the sky. "Bind him," the voice commanded, "or the sky will fall." Betty woke up with a gasp, her fur standing on end, the morning sun streaming through her window. The city of Celestia Harbor was awake, outside, the hum of traffic vibrating through the walls. She was safe. She was in her apartment. But the smell of ozone lingered in her nose, and the sensation of the golden light clinging to her skin was so real, she almost expected to glow when she looked in the mirror. By the time Betty arrived at Nebula Brew, she had consumed 3 caffeine patches and was vibrating at a frequency that made her whiskers twitch uncontrollably. "You look like you stuck your tail in a power socket," Rook observed, as she marched behind the counter. The 4-armed pastry chef was carefully arranging a pyramid of glowing blue muffins. "Did the bonded channel keep you up again? I saw the notification. Partner purchased antifungal foot cream." "Very romantic." "He did not purchase foot cream," Betty snapped, tying her apron with aggressive knots. "And if you mention the channel one more time, I will replace your sugar supply with salt." "It was on the public feed," Rook said, raising 2 of his hands in surrender, while the other 2 continued to dust powdered sugar. "The system is glitching hard, Betty. It is listing you 2 as a primary resource unit. That classification does not even exist for civilians. It is military grade." "It is a bug," Betty insisted, turning on the espresso machine. The familiar hiss of steam was grounding. "I filed a ticket with the Central IT department. They said they would look into it in 6 to 8 business weeks." 6 to 8 weeks, Rook mused. "By then you 2 will be married and have 3 small hairless children." "Disgusting," Betty shuddered. "Humans are so squishy." The bell above the door chimed. "Speak of the devil, and he shall appear looking exhausted and carrying a small, energetic chaos demon." Jim Thorne walked in, holding Mira's hand. He looked better than he had in Betty's dream, but there were still dark circles under his eyes. He wore a fresh flight suit, though the collar was crooked, and he was carrying a toy robot that seemed to be missing a leg. "Good morning," Mira chirped, breaking free from her father's grip and sprinting toward the counter. "Betty, did you get the notification Dad bought spicy noodles for breakfast? I told him it was a bad idea." Jim groaned, sliding onto a stool. "You did not have to broadcast that to the whole shop, Mira. And good morning, Betty. Rook." "Spicy noodles." Betty raised an eyebrow, her hands automatically moving to prepare his usual black coffee. "Living dangerously, are we?" "It was the only thing the vending machine had left," Jim defended, rubbing his face. "And for the record, I did not buy foot cream. That was a targeted ad that the system logged as a purchase. I have excellent foot hygiene, thank you very much." Betty felt a laugh bubble up in her chest, surprising her. The tension from the nightmare began to dissipate in the face of his mundane, awkward humanity. I will note that in your permanent file. Subject has excellent feet. Very crucial data. She slid the coffee across the counter. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. Zap. It wasn't a static shock. It was a pulse. A warm, golden ripple traveled up Betty's arm, settled in her chest, and echoed in the floorboards beneath them. The espresso machine gave a happy little burp of steam, and the lights in the shop brightened by 10%. Jim pulled his hand back, blinking. Static, he muttered. Dry air. Yeah, Betty said, her voice tight. Dry air. She turned away quickly to make Mira's Sparkle Fizz lemonade, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was getting stronger. The proximity was making it stronger. So, Mira said, climbing onto her stool and pulling out a sketchbook. I drew a picture of us. She slammed the book onto the counter. It was a crayon drawing surprisingly detailed for a 10-year-old. It showed a tall stick figure with messy hair, Jim, a smaller stick figure with purple sparkles, Mira, and a large, fierce-looking cat standing on two legs, wearing an apron and holding a lightning bolt. Betty. Why am I holding a lightning bolt? Betty asked, leaning over to look. Because you are the boss, Mira stated matter-of-factly. And bosses have power. Also, the lights flicker when you get mad, like a superhero. Jim choked on his coffee. Mira, eat your muffin. Betty stared at the drawing. The lights flicker when you get mad. Even a child could see it. Why couldn't she just admit it to herself? It is a very nice drawing, Betty said softly. But I am not a superhero kid. I am just a barista who controls the caffeine supply. Same thing, Mira shrugged. The morning rush began in earnest, but the dynamic in the shop had shifted. Jim didn't leave immediately after his coffee. He stayed tapping away at his datapad, occasionally looking up to watch Betty work. Mira sat at the end of the counter doing her homework, and occasionally asking Betty for help with math problems. It felt domestic. It felt dangerous. During a lull in the customers, Betty found herself leaning against the counter near Jim. He was staring at a cargo manifest, his brow furrowed. Problem with the load? She asked. Jim looked up, startled, then relaxed. Just weight distribution again. I am hauling volatile medical isotopes to the upper sector hospitals today. The containment units are heavy, and the Rusty Starling has a slight list to port. If I don't balance it perfectly, the mag locks on the docking clamp might shear off. You worry about the clamps a lot, Betty observed. Most pilots just trust the auto-docking sequence. Jim's expression darkened. The humor vanished from his eyes, replaced by a deep, haunted well of memory. He looked down at his hands. I don't trust auto-docking. Not anymore, Betty waited. She could feel the bonded channel buzzing in the back of her mind, transmitting a wave of grief, so potent it tasted like ash on her tongue. My wife, Jim said quietly. Sarah. She was a structural engineer. 5 years ago, she was on a transport shuttle coming back from the ring station. The auto-docking system miscalculated the approach speed by 0.4%. It was a negligible error for a cargo hauler, but for a passenger shuttle, it clipped the containment field. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The silence stretched between them heavy and suffocating. The investigation ruled it a statistical anomaly. Jim continued, his voice devoid of emotion. But I saw the logs. The system knew. It prioritized the schedule over the safety buffer. Since then, I fly manual. I check the clamps. I check the weight. If I am the one flying, I know who to blame if it goes wrong. Betty felt a sharp pang in her chest, not from the bond this time, but from her own memory. She saw a flash of blinding white light. She heard the sound of a scream cut short. I understand, Betty said. Her voice was barely a whisper. The systems are not infallible. They are built on old code and older promises. Jim looked at her. Really looked at her, his eyes searching her face. You sound like you speak from experience. Betty looked away, focusing on a spot on the counter. My uncle, she said. He was involved in the maintenance of the city infrastructure a long time ago. He believed in the old ways, the manual ways. He told me that relying too much on the core's automation makes us complacent. He died in a maintenance shaft because a sensor failed to detect a plasma leak. The system said the sector was clear. It was a half-truth. Her uncle had been the previous Lumen Warden. He hadn't just died. He had been consumed by the energy because he didn't have an anchor to ground him. He had burned out like a fuse, trying to hold the city up with sheer willpower. Jim reached out his hand, hovering over hers for a moment before retreating. I am sorry, Betty. I guess we are both members of the Trust Issues with Technology Club. President and Vice President, Betty managed a weak smile. Dad, Mira called out from the end of the counter. I finished my math. Can we go to the observation deck before you have to leave? Please, the clouds are purple today. Jim shook his head, clearing the heavy atmosphere. He forced a smile for his daughter. Sure, Gremlin. 5 minutes. Then I have to go be a glorious space truck driver. As they gathered their things, Betty watched them. She saw the way Jim checked Mira's jacket zipper. She saw the way he scanned the room unconsciously, assessing threats. He was a protector, a man who had lost everything and decided that the only way to survive was to hold on to what remained with a grip of steel. The anchor, the voice from her dream whispered. No, Betty thought firmly. He is just a man. Leave him alone. The day wore on, transitioning from the morning calm into the chaotic energy of the evening rush. The sun dipped below the horizon, and Celestia Harbor lit up like a Christmas tree. Neon signs flickered to life, and the traffic lanes outside became rivers of red and white light. Nebula Brew was packed. The air was thick with the smell of roasted beans, steamed milk, and the various pheromones of a dozen different species. Betty was in the zone, her 4 limbs moving in a blur of efficiency. But the unease was back. It started as a low-frequency hum vibrating in the fillings of her teeth, the lumen core. It wasn't just skipping beats now. It was shuddering. Something is wrong, Betty thought, pausing with a pitcher of milk in midair. She closed her eyes for a second, extending her senses downward, past the metal floor, past the support struts down, into the glowing heart of the city. The flow was turbulent. Someone or something was agitating the energy stream. It felt synthetic, artificial, like someone throwing rocks into a smooth river to create ripples. Betty, order for table 6, Rook yelled. Betty snapped her eyes open. Coming. She tried to focus, but the disruption was growing. The lights in the shop flickered. The music system skipped a track. Then the door opened. Jim and Mira were back. Forgot the data pad, Jim called out, waving the device as he entered. Left it on the counter. Can't fly without the manifest. You would lose your head if it was not screwed on, Betty said, forcing a teasing tone. But her ears were swiveled back, listening to the groan of the building's superstructure. I got it, Mira yelled, racing toward the counter. Mira, slow down, Jim warned. The ground lurched. It wasn't a subtle vibration this time. It was a violent jarring shift, as if the entire tower had dropped a foot in altitude and then slammed to a halt. Cups rattled on their saucers. A customer screamed. The lights went out, completely plunging the shop into darkness for a terrifying 3 seconds before the emergency red backup lights bathed the room in a sinister crimson glow. What was that? A customer yelled. Earthquake. We are in the sky, someone else shouted. It is an engine failure. The city is falling. Panic rippled through the room. Stay calm, Betty shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. It is just a stabilizer adjustment. Stay in your seats. But she knew it wasn't. She could feel the lumen bleeding out of the main conduit. Mira, Jim's voice was sharp with fear. Betty looked toward the entrance. Mira wasn't at the counter. In the confusion of the blackout, she had moved. I am here, Dad. Mira's voice came from the back of the shop near the transition tubes, the glass pneumatic elevators that connected the shop to the lower promenade. I dropped my toy. Don't move, Jim shouted, pushing his way through the crowd of confused patrons. Betty vaulted over the counter, landing silently on the balls of her feet. She beat Jim to the back of the shop. Mira was standing inside the glass tube of the elevator. The doors were closed, and the panel on the outside was dead. The door won't open, Mira cried, pressing her hands against the glass. Her voice was muffled. Daddy! Jim reached the tube, slamming his hands against the glass. Mira, step back! He grabbed the emergency release lever and pulled. It didn't budge. It is jammed. The power surge locked the mag seals. He turned to the control panel, his fingers flying over the keypad, trying to bypass the lock. Come on, come on! The backup generator is not kicking in for the transport grid, Betty said, her eyes scanning the tube. She could see the flow of energy, or the lack of it. The clamp was frozen in the locked position. It is a hard lockout. I can force it, Jim said, his voice rising in panic. He looked around for something heavy. I need a pry bar. Rook. Do you have a crowbar? I have a rolling pin, Rook offered helpfully, looking terrified. That won't work, Betty said. She looked at Mira. The girl was crying now, the red emergency light making her tears look like blood. The air in those tubes was limited. If the ventilation was down too, Betty felt the panic radiating from Jim. It was a tsunami of fear. Not again. Not again. I cannot lose her. The bond between them screamed. Betty made a choice. She stepped between Jim and the door. Jim, move. What? No, I said move. Betty shoved him aside with a strength that surprised both of them. She placed both hands on the cold glass of the door. She didn't look at the keypad. She didn't look at the lever. She looked at the magnetic seal mechanism embedded in the frame. Listen to me, she commanded silently. She didn't pray to the core. She didn't ask. She ordered. She reached into that well of power that she had ignored for 10 years, the power that flowed through her bloodline. She grabbed the stagnant energy inside the lock and pulled. Open. A spark of pure, blinding white light erupted from her palms. It wasn't electricity. It was liquid starlight. It flared for a fraction of a second, hot and intense. Clack. The magnetic seals disengaged with a sound like a gunshot. The doors hissed and slid open. Mira stumbled out coughing. Jim was there instantly, scooping her up into his arms, burying his face in her hair. I got you. I got you. You are okay. Betty stumbled back, leaning against the wall. Her hands were smoking slightly. She quickly shoved them into the pockets of her apron. Her heart was beating so fast, she thought it might explode. She had exposed herself. She had used warden manipulation in a room full of people. Slowly, Jim lifted his head. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Betty. His eyes were wide. He looked at the door, then at her pockets, then back at her face. He was a pilot. He knew mechanics. He knew that a dead maglock didn't just open because you touched it. And he had seen the light. Betty, he said, his voice hoarse. How did you do that? I hit the sweet spot, Betty stammered, her usual wit failing her. Percussive maintenance. It is a Faliri trick. Percussive maintenance doesn't make the air smell like ozone, Jim said quietly. He stood up, still holding Mira tight. The look he gave her wasn't fear exactly. It was confusion, laced with a sudden sharp suspicion. Who are you, Betty? Before she could answer, the main lights flickered back on. The hum of the city returned to its normal pitch. The earthquake was over. Oh, thank the stars, a customer shouted. Power is back. The tension in the room broke. People started laughing nervously, checking their drinks, moving on. But the bubble of silence around Betty and Jim remained. I need to take her home, Jim said, his voice stiff. He was putting up a wall. She could feel it. The bond was transmitting a new emotion, mistrust. She is shaken up. Yeah, Betty said, her throat dry. You should. Go. Jim hesitated. He looked like he wanted to ask more, to demand an answer. But Mira sniffled against his shoulder, and the father in him won out. He turned and walked out of the shop without looking back. Betty watched them go. She felt cold. That was close, Rook whispered, appearing at her elbow. Too close. You surged, Betty. Your eyes were glowing. I know, Betty whispered. He saw, Rook said. I know. An hour later, the shop was closed. Betty stood on the small balcony at the back of Nebula Brew, overlooking the glittering abyss of the city. The wind whipped at her fur, cold and biting. The news feeds were already spinning the story. Huge holographic screens on the nearby skyscrapers were broadcasting the face of Counselor Ardan Morel. Citizens of Celestia Harbor, Ardan's smooth voice echoed through the canyons of steel. Tonight's minor instability was a regrettable incident. Our engineers have traced the source to a harmonic dissonance caused by unauthorized engine modifications in the lower docking sectors. Betty gripped the railing. Liar. It has come to the Council's attention, Ardan continued, that certain species, specifically those from non-Concord worlds, bring with them a biological and technological signature that disrupts the delicate frequency of the lumen core. We must ask ourselves, is the safety of our great city worth the risk of unchecked integration? He wasn't explicitly naming humans, but he didn't have to. The camera cut to a stock footage clip of a human freighter, looking suspiciously like Jim's ship docking clumsily. He is setting them up, Betty realized with a sickening lurch. He is creating a scapegoat. Her wrist terminal buzzed. She looked down, expecting a message from Rook, or perhaps a spam notification. It was neither. The screen went black, then displayed a single golden symbol, a stylized eye inside a gear. The mark of the High Concordance. The mark of the Wardens. System alert lumen. Warden signature confirmed. Identity Betty of the Faliri. Status awakened. Primary anchor bond, James Thorne. Bond strength, 89% and rising. Directive. The core is under siege. Protect the anchor. Protect the city. Betty stared at the screen, her breath hitching in her throat. There was no denying it now. The system had logged her power surge. It matched her biosignature. She was back on the grid. I didn't ask for this, she hissed at the sky. I am just a barista. Another vibration buzzed on her wrist. This one was different. It was a standard text message. She swiped to open it. It was from Jim. Jim, hey. Mira is asleep. She is okay. I just wanted to say thanks. I do not know what you did back there, and I do not know if I believe in percussive maintenance. But you saved her, so thanks. Jim also. Sorry if I was weird. I just panic when it comes to her. You know, Betty read the message twice. She could feel the hesitation in his typing, the awkwardness, but also the sincerity. Despite his suspicion, despite the fear, he had reached out. She looked at the golden warning of the Warden Directive, then at the simple white text of the human pilot. The bond wasn't just a system glitch. It wasn't just magic. It was two broken people standing on the edge of a precipice, realizing that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to fall alone. Betty typed a reply, her fingers trembling. Betty. She is a tough kid. She takes after her dad, Betty, and Jim. Be careful. The turbulence isn't over. She hit send. As the message flew through the digital ether, Betty looked down at the glowing heart of the city miles below. She narrowed her eyes, the slit pupils dilating as she tapped into the senses she had tried to bury. All right, Ardan, she whispered, her tail lashing behind her. You want to blame the new guys. You want to mess with my city and my friends. She let a small spark of lumen energy dance between her claws. Come and try it. She turned back into the dark apartment. The barista was off duty. The warden was clocking in. The Festival of Unity was, in Betty's professional opinion, a logistical nightmare designed specifically to test the patience of service workers. Celestia Harbor was vibrating literally and metaphorically. The mid-level plaza, usually a thoroughfare for commuters and delivery drones, had been transformed into a riot of color and sound. Streamers made of bioluminescent silk hung from the upper support struts, casting a neon glow over the throngs of tourists. Stalls, selling everything from roasted void squid to deep-fried nebula dough, lined the walkways. And Nebula Brew, situated perfectly at the edge of the main viewing platform, was ground zero for the caffeine-deprived masses. "I need 3 Galaxy lattes, 2 void espressos, and a muffin that does not scream when I bite it." A customer, a large blue-skinned Centaurian, barked at the counter. "The screaming muffins are a delicacy on Sector 7, but we are out of them," Betty said, her voice flat. She punched the order into the terminal. "That will be 45 credits. Please wait at the collection point." 45, the Centaurian grumbled. "That is robbery. That is capitalism in zero-G," Betty retorted, turning to the espresso machine. Rook was moving like a whirlwind behind her, his 4 arms a blur of motion. "Betty, we are low on oat milk again, and the steam wand is making that sound. The one that sounds like a dying whale." "Just hit it, Rook. Percussive maintenance," Betty muttered, steaming a pitcher of milk with a little more aggression than necessary. Despite the chaos, her ears were swiveled toward the massive panoramic window. Outside, beyond the crush of the crowd, the sky was filled with ships. It was the grand aerial parade, the highlight of the festival. Dozens of vessels, from sleek council interceptors to heavy cargo haulers, were flying in formation, weaving through the floating towers of the city to celebrate the anniversary of the conquered. And right there in the formation designated for the Transport Guild was a beat-up, slightly rusted hauler that looked like a flying brick among diamonds, the Rusty Starling. Betty felt a tug in her chest, the invisible thread that had been pulled taut ever since that ridiculous friend request. It wasn't just anxiety anymore. It was a constant, low-frequency hum of shared awareness. She could feel Jim's pulse. It was elevated, 110 beats per minute. He was nervous. "Focus, Jim," she whispered under her breath as she poured foam into a cup. "Did you say something?" Rook asked, sliding a tray of pastries into the display case. "I said focus on the foam, Rook," Betty lied. She glanced at the corner booth. Mira was there, kneeling on the seat, her nose pressed against the glass. She was wearing a pair of oversized pilot goggles and holding a banner that read, "Go Dad Go," in glittery, uneven letters. She looked fearless. Betty wished she felt the same. The city felt heavy today. The Lumen Core, the massive heart of Celestia Harbor, was singing a song that was all wrong. It was a discordant melody, full of sharp spikes and sudden drops. It felt like a fever. On the large holographic screens suspended above the plaza, the face of Councillor Ardon Mirel appeared. He was smiling, his transparent skin glowing with a performative warmth. "Citizens of the Concord," his voice boomed smooth as polished glass. "Today, we celebrate our diversity. We celebrate the strength of our union. But let us also remember that strength requires order. Stability requires vigilance." Betty narrowed her eyes. Vigilance. That was Ardon's code word for control. "And here comes the civilian transport wing." The announcer's voice overrode Ardon's speech. "Led by Captain Yara, followed by the indomitable independent haulers who keep our city fed and supplied." A cheer went up from the crowd. Outside, the ships banked in a wide arc, their engines leaving trails of colored plasma. Betty tuned into the bonded channel. It was an invasion of privacy she was still getting used to, but right now she needed to know he was okay. "Don't mess this up," Thorn Jim's internal monologue drifted across the link. "Watch the port thruster. The stabilizer is sticky. Keep it smooth. Mira is watching." Betty smiled despite herself. He wasn't thinking about the glory. He was thinking about his daughter. Then, the song of the city screamed. It wasn't a sound audible to the ear. It was a psychic shriek that tore through Betty's skull, blinding her for a fraction of a second with white-hot pain. The lumen core didn't just fluctuate. It lurched. It was as if a giant hand had reached into the foundation of the city and yanked the main drive shaft. Snap. The floor of Nebula Brew tilted. It wasn't a subtle shift this time. The entire mid-level sector dropped 5 feet in a single, heart-stopping second. The sound was deafening, thousands of tons of metal groaning under stress glass, shattering, people screaming. The espresso machine slid off the counter and crashed to the floor in a cloud of steam and sparks. "Mira," Betty yelled, ignoring the scalding water splashing on her apron. She scrambled over the debris toward the corner booth. Mira had been thrown from her seat, but was clinging to the table leg, her eyes wide with terror. "I have got you!" Betty shouted, grabbing the girl and pulling her under the sturdy frame of the table. "Stay down!" Outside the window, the parade had turned into chaos. The sudden gravity shift had thrown the tight formation into disarray. 2 sleek interceptors collided, spinning away in a shower of debris. The heavier ships were struggling to maintain altitude. The city groaned again, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated in the marrow of every bone. The horizon line, usually level with the window, tilted sharply to the right. "We are falling," a customer screamed. "The stabilizers are gone." "Silence!" Betty roared, her voice amplified by a surge of warden authority she didn't bother to suppress. The sheer force of her command stunned the panic in the room for a second. "Rook, get everyone to the inner corridor. It is structurally sounder move." Rook, pale and shaking, nodded with all 4 heads. "Everybody follow the pastry chef. Move, move." As the customers scrambled toward the back, Betty looked out the window. She wasn't looking at the fleeing ships. She was looking at the rusty Starling. Jim's ship was fighting. It was caught in a vortex of turbulence near one of the massive stabilizer pylons, the great pillars that kept the city upright. The ship was bucking like a wild animal, its engines flaring erratically. The bond in her head exploded with panic. Controls locked. Nav computer says turn left. Left is the pylon. Why does it say turn left? Betty gripped the window frame, her claws digging into the metal. She closed her eyes and reached out. She dove past the panic, past the noise, deep into the energetic blueprint of the city. She saw it. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a command. Deep in the central nervous system of the lumen core, a foreign code was executing. It was rerouting power away from the gyroscopes and pushing the flight guidance systems of nearby ships into a collision course with the supports. "Ardan," she hissed. He wasn't just creating a scare. He was orchestrating a disaster. If a human ship crashed into the stabilizer pylon during a moment of instability, the resulting structural failure would be catastrophic, and the blame would fall squarely on the incompetent human pilot. On the plaza screens, Ardan's face returned, looking grave and concerned. "Citizens, do not panic," Ardan shouted. "The lumen core is reacting violently to an incompatible biorhythmic signature in the flight grid. The chaotic energy of the human vessels is destabilizing the matrix. We must ground them immediately." "You lying sack of crystal!" Betty snarled. The crowd in the plaza, terrified and looking for someone to blame, began to point at the screen, then at the sky. The narrative was setting like concrete. Humans broke the city. Betty looked at the rusty Starling. It was diving. The navigation computer was forcing it down straight toward the primary joint of the north pylon. If Jim hit that, the entire northern sector would collapse. Thousands would die. "And Jim, no," Betty said. She turned to Mira, who was huddled under the table, clutching her Go Dad Go banner. "Mira," Betty said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "I need you to be brave." "Can you do that?" Mira nodded, tears streaming down her glittering cheeks. "Is my dad okay?" "I am going to make sure he is," Betty said. "Stay with Rook. Do not come out until I say so." Betty stood up. She ripped off her apron. She wasn't a barista anymore. She walked to the shattered window. The wind howled through the cracks, smelling of ozone and fear. She placed her hand on the glass. Friend request accepted, she thought. Protocol, total integration. She closed her eyes and let the wall fall. High above the screaming city inside the cockpit of the rusty Starling, Jim Thorne was wrestling with a ghost. "Pull up, you piece of junk!" he screamed, hauling back on the yoke with both hands. His biceps burned. The veins in his neck stood out like cords. The ship wasn't listening. The controls were dead. The stick was vibrating violently, fighting him. Alert. Collision imminent. Correcting course. The automated voice was calm, soothing, and completely insane. The correction was banking him hard, to port directly into the massive steel lattice of the stabilizer pylon. "That is not a correction," Jim yelled at the dashboard. "That is a suicide run." He slammed his hand on the manual override switch. Nothing. The red light blinked mockingly. Override disabled. Flight path locked by central traffic control. They locked me out. Jim realized a cold numbness spreading through his chest. They are flying me remotely. He looked out the canopy. The pylon was rushing up to meet him, a wall of gray metal. He had 10 seconds, maybe 8. A memory flashed before his eyes. Sarah, the shuttle crash, the report saying system error, the feeling of helplessness, the feeling of being a passenger in his own death. "Not again," he ground out. "I am not doing this again." He reached under the console, ripping open a panel marked Maintenance Only. There was a bundle of wires there, the hard line to the flight computer. If he cut it, he lost all stabilization. He lost the HUD. He lost the dampeners. He would be flying a 50-ton brick on pure thrust and prayer. "Do it," a voice said in his head. Jim froze. The voice wasn't his. It wasn't the ship. It was clear, sharp, and sounded exactly like the barista who scolded him for drinking too much caffeine. "Betty, cut the line, Jim," the voice commanded. It resonated in his skull, vibrating in his teeth. "Cut the line. I have got you." Jim didn't question it. He didn't have time. He grabbed the wire bundle with his gloved hand and yanked. Sparks. The cockpit went dark. The HUD vanished. The soothing voice of the computer died. The yoke suddenly went slack in his hands, then jerked violently as the atmospheric turbulence grabbed the ship. The rusty Starling dropped like a stone, the artificial gravity failing. "I have no control," Jim shouted, fighting to keep the ship from entering a flat spin. "I am falling." "You are not falling." Betty's voice came again, stronger this time. It felt like a warm hand placed on the back of his neck. "You are the anchor. Be the weight." "I don't know what that means," Jim yelled internally. Suddenly the world turned gold. It wasn't the sun. It was a grid. A massive, shimmering lattice of golden light erupted from the mid-level sector of the city, shooting upward like a geyser. It spread out, catching the falling debris, wrapping around the swaying towers. And it wrapped around the rusty Starling. Jim felt the ship shudder, but not from impact. It felt like he had hit a net. The violent shaking stopped. The ship stabilized, held in a cradle of pure energy. Down in the shattered window of Nebula Brew, Betty stood with her arms raised. Her eyes were no longer brown. They were pools of blinding white light. Her fur stood on end, crackling with static. She was channeling the entire chaotic flow of the lumen core through her own body, weaving it into a structure. She wasn't just holding the ship. She was holding the city, the pylon. Betty projected her thoughts, straining with effort. The north pylon is buckling. It needs a counterweight. The dampeners are offline. You have to push it back. Push it back, Jim watched as the massive tower swayed toward the city. With my ship, yes. The nose of your ship has a magnetic docking clamp. Lock onto the pylon. Use your main thrusters. Push it back into alignment. That is crazy, Jim thought, his hands flying over the manual throttle controls. If I miss, I crush the cockpit. You won't miss, Betty said. I am your HUD now. In Jim's mind, a new vision overlaid his eyesight. It wasn't digital. It was organic. He saw the wind currents as ribbons of blue. He saw the stress points on the pylon as glowing red fractures. He saw the perfect path, a golden line drawn through the air. He grinned, a wild, desperate grin. "Roger that control," he whispered. He slammed the throttles forward. The rusty Starling roared its engines, spitting blue fire. He didn't look at the dead instruments. He looked at the golden line in his head. He dove. He banked hard, feeling the G-force crush him into his seat. The pylon loomed. 3, 2, 1 now. Jim fired the retro thrusters. The ship spun 180 degrees, flying backward. He engaged the magnetic clamp. Clang. The ship shuddered violently as it latched onto the massive steel beam of the pylon. "Full power!" Jim screamed. He pushed the throttle to 110%. The engines screamed in protest. The frame of the ship groaned. But the thrust hit the pylon. For a second, nothing happened. The tower continued to lean, threatening to crush the residential sector below. "Push, Jim," Betty screamed in his mind. "Push." He felt her power flood into him. It wasn't just energy. It was will. It was the stubborn refusal to let things break. It was the anger of a woman who had lost too much, and the love of a father who refused to lose anything else. The rusty Starling turned into a star. The fusion drive flared white-hot. Slowly, agonizingly, the groan of metal changed pitch. The pylon stopped moving. Then, with a screech that shattered windows 5 miles away, it began to move back, inch by inch, degree by degree. "Come on!" Jim roared, tears streaming down his face. "Hold it! Hold it locked!" A massive boom echoed across the city as the pylon slammed back into its locking mechanism. The emergency latches engaged. The city stopped shaking. Jim cut the engines. He slumped in his seat, gasping for air. His hands were shaking so hard, he couldn't let go of the yoke. "Did we do it?" he wheezed. "We did," Betty's voice was faint, now trembling. "But we are not done. Look at the screens." Jim looked down at the plaza below. The giant holographic screens were still active. Ardan Mirel was there, but he wasn't smiling anymore. He looked furious. "This is an attack," Ardan was shouting, pointing at the golden energy net that still shimmered around the city. "The Faliri Witch and the human pilot are conspiring to seize the core. They have hacked the system. I am authorizing lethal force to neutralize the threat." Defense drones began to detach from the upper spires, their weapons locking onto the rusty Starling. "Oh, come on," Jim groaned. "Can't a guy catch a break?" "He is trying to silence us," Betty said. "He is using the master override code. Level 0 access." "Can you stop him?" "No," Betty said. "But the core can. The core hates a liar." "What do we do?" "I need you to open the connection, Jim. The one between us. Fully." "I thought it was open." "No. That was just the door. I need you to let me in. All the way. No secrets, no fear. I need the anchor to ground the truth." Jim hesitated. To let someone into his mind, into the dark places where he kept the grief for Sarah. Where did he keep his insecurity about being a useless pilot? He looked at the photo of Mira taped to his dashboard. "All right," he whispered. "Come on in." He closed his eyes and lowered the mental walls. The sensation was overwhelming. It wasn't like a voice anymore. It was like becoming someone else. He felt Betty's exhaustion. He felt her sharp, dry humor. He felt her terrified love for the city. And beneath it all, he felt her admiration for him. She didn't see a broken widower. She saw a man who could hold up the sky. And Betty felt him. She felt the depth of his loyalty, the quiet strength that kept him going when he wanted to give up. The two souls snapped together like two halves of a magnet. Warden and anchor. Verified. The energy net around the city pulsed. It changed color from gold to a blinding diamond-hard white. Betty, standing in the wreckage of the coffee shop, raised a trembling hand and pointed at the nearest holographic screen. "Ardan Mirel," she spoke, but her voice was amplified by every speaker in the city. You have logged 342 unauthorized commands into the Lumen Core in the last hour. Ardon, on the screen, froze. Cut the feed! Cut the audio! He shrieked at his aides off-screen. You cannot cut the feed! Betty continued, her voice echoing like a god. I am the feed. On every screen in Celestia Harbor, Ardon's face was replaced by a stream of data. It was a log, a detailed, undeniable record of his commands. Command Diverge Stabilizer 4. Command Disable Safety Buffers. Command Override. Nav Path Target Rusty Starling. Command Initiate Media Protocol. Blame Human. The crowd in the plaza went silent. The drones hovering near Jim's ship paused, their AI confused by the conflicting data. The core records everything, Counselor, Betty's voice rang out. It remembers every command, and it knows who tried to break it. On the screen, the data stream cleared, showing a live feed of Ardon in the council chamber. He was frantically trying to smash a terminal. It is a lie, Ardon screamed, looking wild. It is a fabrication. It is the truth, Jim's voice joined Betty's, broadcasting from his cockpit. And we are done being your scapegoats. The defense drones turned. They didn't fire. They simply rotated their sensors away from the Rusty Starling and toward the council tower. The crowd in the plaza erupted. I didn't panic this time. It was rage. Betty let out a long, shuddering breath. The golden light faded from her eyes. The energy net dissolved into sparkling motes of dust that drifted down over the city like snow. She collapsed. Betty! Rook shouted, catching her with his lower arms before she hit the floor. I am okay, she whispered, though she felt like she had just run a marathon while carrying a shuttle. I just need a nap, a really long nap. High above, Jim slumped in his cockpit. The Rusty Starling was still clamped to the pylon, hanging vertically over the city. Nebula Brew, this is Rusty Starling, he croaked into the radio. Delivery complete, but I think I am going to need a tow, and a very strong coffee. Down in the shop, Mira crawled out from under the table. She ran to the window, looking up at the tiny speck of her father's ship against the sunset. He did it, she whispered. Then she yelled, My dad fixed the sky. Betty, half-conscious in Rook's arms, managed a weak smile. Yeah, kid, she murmured. He is pretty good with a wrench. The sun had set by the time emergency crews managed to tow the Rusty Starling to a secure landing pad. The city was still buzzing, but the tone had changed. The fear had turned into a frenetic, angry energy. The council building was surrounded by protesters. Ardon Morel had been taken into custody by the High Guard, mostly for his own protection from the mob. Jim walked down the ramp of his ship. His legs felt like jelly. A medical team was waiting, but he pushed past them. I am fine. I just need to find my daughter. Dad! Mira launched herself at him like a projectile. Jim caught her wincing as her momentum hit his bruised ribs, but he didn't let go. He buried his face in her neck, breathing in the smell of strawberry shampoo and ozone. I was so scared, Mira sobbed. Me too, baby. Me too, Jim whispered. He looked up. Standing at the edge of the landing pad, wrapped in a thermal blanket and looking thoroughly disheveled, was Betty. Her fur was matted. She had a bandage on her arm, but her eyes were clear. Jim put Mira down, keeping one hand on her shoulder, and walked over to the Faliri. They stood there for a moment, the noise of the emergency crews fading into the background. Percussive maintenance, Jim asked, raising an eyebrow. Advanced percussive maintenance, Betty corrected, pulling the blanket tighter. Proprietary technology. You glowed, Jim said, like a light bulb. You flew a cargo hauler backward into a structural support beam, Betty countered. Like a maniac, Jim let out a short, incredulous laugh. We make a pretty terrible team. The worst, Betty agreed. She looked at him, and the connection flared again, soft, warm, and permanent. It wasn't shouting anymore. It was just there. A hum in the back of her mind said, "I am here." "So," Jim said, scuffing his boot on the deck, "does this mean we are official like Facebook official?" Betty rolled her eyes, but her tail gave a traitorous little twitch of happiness. "Do not push your luck, flyboy. You still owe me for the coffee." "Put it on my tab," Jim smiled. "Captain Thorne, Miss Betty." A stern voice cut through the moment. They turned to see Captain Yara marching toward them, flanked by 2 members of the High Guard. Yara looked exhausted, but her eyes were sharp. "We need to talk," Yara said, stopping in front of them. "The council is in shambles. Ardon is in the brig, and half the city thinks you two are the second coming of the first builders." She gestured to the skyline, where giant holograms of Betty and Jim taken from security footage were being displayed on the news feeds. "The Guardians of Celestia Harbor," the headlines screamed. "You can't go back to pouring coffee, Betty," Yara said quietly. "And you, Thorne, you are not going to be just a pilot anymore." Betty looked at Jim. Jim looked at Betty. The secret was out. The quiet life was dead. "Well," Jim said, reaching out and taking Betty's paw in his hand. It felt natural. It felt right. "I guess we should ask for a raise," Betty squeezed his hand. "At least 50%. "Make it 60, Jim said. As the cameras flashed and the city roared around them, the cat and the pilot stood together, anchored in the storm they had just weathered, ready for whatever hurricane came next. The dust had not yet settled over Celestia Harbor. 3 days had passed since the incident at the North Pylon, and the city was in a state of nervous, vibrating recovery. Repair drones buzzed around the structural supports like swarms of angry metal bees, their welding torches flashing blue and white against the steel gray of the skyline. The air smelled of ozone-burnt circuitry and the lingering copper tang of discharged lumen energy. For the citizens of the vertical city, the narrative was shifting faster than the wind currents. At first, there was relief. Then, adulation. The cat warden and the pilot dad were trending topics on every social feed from the lower sumps to the gilded spires of the High Council. But fame, as Jim Thorne was quickly discovering, was a double-edged sword, and the blade was currently pressed against his throat. "Suspended," Jim asked, his voice echoing in the sterile white office of the Transport Guild Authority. "What do you mean, suspended?" Across the desk, a bureaucrat with skin like wrinkled parchment and 4 eyes, none of which would meet Jim's gaze, shuffled a stack of holographic files. "Indefinite administrative leave, Mr. Thorne," the bureaucrat said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Pending a full investigation into the irregularities of your flight path during the Festival of Unity." "Irregularities!" Jim stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the floor. "I saved the pylon. I used my ship as a structural clamp. If I had not done that, half the residential district would be floating in the stratosphere right now. And in doing so," the bureaucrat droned, "you violated 17 separate articles of the Flight Safety Protocol, disabled your mandatory navigation governor, and engaged in unauthorized docking with municipal infrastructure. The legal team calls it reckless endangerment of a heritage site." "Captain Yara saw it," Jim argued, slamming his hand on the desk. "She was there. She can testify that the navigation systems were compromised." "Captain Yara's testimony has been noted," the bureaucrat said, finally looking up. His upper eyes blinked slowly. "However, with Councillor Ardon Morel currently challenging the validity of the logs shown during the broadcast, the Guild must remain neutral. Until the inquiry is complete, your flight license is revoked. You are grounded, Mr. Thorne." Grounded. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. For a pilot, it was a death sentence. But for a single father living paycheck to paycheck in one of the most expensive cities in the galaxy, it was worse. It was a countdown. "How am I supposed to pay rent?" Jim asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "How am I supposed to feed my daughter?" "The Guild suggests you file for unemployment credits," the bureaucrat said, dismissing him with a wave of a withered hand. "Next case." Jim walked out of the office, feeling the weight of the city pressing down on his shoulders. He walked to the window of the corridor and looked out. Far below, on a private landing pad, the rusty Starling sat covered in tarps and security tape. His ship, his freedom, his home. He felt a phantom vibration in his chest, the bond. It rippled with a sudden sharp spike of indignation. "They are idiots," Betty's voice echoed in his mind clear as a bell. "Bureaucratic paper-shuffling idiots." Jim closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the cool glass. "Get out of my head, Betty. I am miserable enough without an audience." "I am not an audience," she replied, the mental tone softening into something warm and grounding. "I am your partner, and I am bringing muffins. Meet me at the shop." While Jim was fighting for his livelihood, Betty was fighting a different kind of battle in the gilded chambers of the High Council. She sat in a chair that was designed for a species with a much longer spine, her tail twitching with irritation as it dangled through the gap. Across from her sat 3 members of the Council's Special Committee on Lumen Stability. They were polite. They were smiling. They were terrifying. "We merely wish to understand the extent of your abilities, Warden," said Councillor Vex, a bird-like creature with iridescent feathers and a beak that looked sharp enough to cut glass. It has been centuries since a Faliri demonstrated such raw control over the core. "It was an emergency," Betty said, keeping her voice level. She missed her apron. She felt naked without the barrier of the espresso machine between her and these people. "I did what I had to do." "And we are grateful," Vex cooed. "Truly. But surely you understand that such power cannot be left unregulated. The Lumen Core is the heart of our city. It cannot be manipulated by a private citizen, especially one who operates a coffee shop." "I am not manipulating it," Betty said. "I am listening to it. There is a difference." "Semantics," another counselor interjected. "The point is, the public is frightened. They saw the sky turn gold. They saw a human ship defy physics. Councillor Ardon Mirel is a traitor," Betty cut in her claws, extending slightly into the armrests of the chair. "He tried to crash the city." "So you claim," Vex said smoothly. "But Ardon insists that the logs you displayed were a fabrication, a hallucination induced by your own psychic projection. He claims that you and the human pilot conspired to stage a crisis so that you could seize power." Betty laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound. "Seize power? I serve lattes for a living. I barely want to manage a shift schedule, let alone a city." "Perhaps," Vex leaned forward. "But the narrative is taking hold. The lower levels are restless. They say the alien and the human are a threat to the natural order. To calm the waters, we have a proposal." He slid a data pad across the polished table. "A position," Vex explained. "Senior consultant for Lumen Affairs. You would work directly under the Council. You would have a generous stipend, secure housing in the upper spires, and full protection." Betty looked at the pad. It was a lot of money. Enough to fix the coffee shop 10 times over. Enough to help Jim. "And the catch?" she asked. "You would renounce your connection to the pilot," Vex said, as if discussing the weather. "The bond between a warden and a human anchor is historically controversial. It implies a dependency that the Council finds uncomfortable. We need you to be a symbol of Faliri strength, not a partner in a cross-species anomaly." Betty stared at him. She felt the bond in the back of her mind, Jim's despair, his worry for Mira, his stubborn, quiet love for his rusty ship. "You want me to cut him off," Betty said slowly, "to sever the bond." "For the greater good," Vex nodded. "We can provide medical assistance to suppress the link. It would be painless." Betty stood up. She picked up the data pad, looked at it for a long moment, and then dropped it onto the floor. It clattered loudly in the silent room. "You do not understand the Lumen Core at all, do you?" Betty said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "It is not a battery you can regulate. It is a living thing. And it does not care about your politics. It chose the anchor, not me, not you. She turned to the door. "Warden," Vex warned his voice, losing its pleasant lilt. "If you walk out that door, we cannot guarantee your safety. The public mood is turning. Ardan's faction is loud." "Let them be loud," Betty hissed, her eyes flashing gold for a split second. "I have heard loud customers before. I am not impressed." She walked out. But as the heavy doors closed behind her, her bravado crumbled. She leaned against the wall of the corridor, her heart hammering. They were isolating them, taking Jim's job, trying to buy her off. Arden was behind bars, but his poison was still circulating through the veins of the city. That evening, Nebula Brew was closed to the public. The "Closed for Repairs" sign hung crookedly on the door, but inside the smell of baking dough and strong coffee created a sanctuary against the cold wind outside. Mira was sitting on the counter, swinging her legs, wearing a spare apron that was 3 sizes too big for her. She was happily frosting a cupcake with neon blue icing. "And then," Mira said, waving a spatula, "Tommy at school said that my dad is a criminal. So I told him that my dad is a superhero and that Tommy is a booger brain." "Eloquent," Rook said, handing her a sprinkle shaker. "Your debate skills are advancing rapidly, small human." Jim sat at one of the few tables that hadn't been smashed during the quake. He had his head in his hands. Betty sat opposite him, sliding a fresh mug of coffee toward his elbow. "I got a notice from the landlord," Jim said, his voice muffled. "Eviction warning. If I do not pay the docking fees for the ship by Friday, they are going to impound it. And since I am suspended, I cannot take any jobs to pay the fees." "It is a trap," Betty said, her tail lashing back and forth under the table. "They are squeezing you to get to me. They think if you break, I will come running to the council for help." "Maybe you should." Jim looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed. "Betty, they offered you a position, protection, money. Maybe you should take it." "Do not start with that," Betty warned. "Look at us." Jim gestured around the damaged shop. "I am a grounded pilot with a 10-year-old daughter and 0 credits. You are a barista with a target on your back. We are not heroes, Betty. We are just collateral damage." "Dad!" Mira jumped down from the counter. She marched over to the table looking fierce in her oversized apron. "Stop it! You are not damage!" She climbed onto Jim's lap and grabbed his face with her sticky, frosting-covered hands. "You saved the city." "Betty saved the city. You are a team, like in the comics." "Real life is not a comic book, Mira," Jim said gently, trying to wipe the blue icing off his cheek. "It is better," Mira insisted, "because in real life you have me, and Rook, and Betty." She turned to Betty. "You are not going to leave him, right, just because some birdman said so." Betty looked at the little girl, then at Jim. She felt the bond hum a low, steady note of longing and fear. "I am not going anywhere," Betty said softly. "I am stubborn. It is a defining trait of my species." The door to the back alley opened with a hiss. Rook stiffened all 4 of his arms, reaching for the nearest rolling pins. "At ease, pastry chef," a gruff voice called out. Captain Yara stepped into the light. She wasn't wearing her uniform. She was dressed in civilian clothes, a heavy trench coat, and a hat pulled low. She looked nervous. "Captain," Jim stood up, putting Mira down. "What are you doing here if the guild sees you with me?" "I am not here on guild business," Yara said, locking the door behind her. She pulled a small data chip from her pocket and placed it on the table. "I am here because I hate dirty politics. And I hate Ardan Morel." They gathered around the table. Yara tapped the chip, and a holographic map of the city projected into the air. It zoomed in on the central spire, deep below the council chambers. "This," Yara pointed to a pulsing red node, "is the Lumen Nexus, the physical control room for the core." "I know what it is," Betty said. "It is holy ground, forbidden. Only the High Keeper is allowed inside." "The High Keeper retired 10 years ago," Yara said. "Ardan has been overseeing the Nexus personally since then. That is how he planted the code to crash the pylon. The logs you showed on the broadcast were just the surface ripples. The actual command scripts, the proof that he planned this months ago, are locked in the Nexus mainframe. So we go get them, Jim said. We hack in. It is air-gapped, Yara shook her head. No remote access. You have to be physically present at the terminal, and the Nexus is guarded by a biometric lock that only responds to two things, the High Keeper or a fully active Warden signature. She looked at Betty. Me, Betty whispered. You, Yara confirmed. If you can get to the terminal, your energy signature will unlock the system. You can download the source code, prove Arden's guilt, beyond a shadow of a doubt, and clear Jim's name. But what? Jim asked. But the Nexus is in the heart of the government sector, Yara said grimly. It is surrounded by the High Guard. And since Arden's faction is spreading rumors that you two are terrorists planning a coup, the guards have orders to shoot on sight if you approach the core. Silence descended on the room. It was a suicide mission. Break into the most secure facility in the city, while being hunted to steal data that might or might not save them. We can't do it, Jim said, shaking his head. It is too dangerous. If Betty gets caught... If we don't do it, Betty interrupted, her voice steel. Arden wins. He will manipulate the investigation. He will come back to power. And then he will expel the humans from Celestia Harbor. He will take your home, Jim. He will take Mira's future. I don't care about the home, Jim shouted. I care about you. I am not going to let you walk into a firing squad because of some ancient destiny. It is not destiny, Betty shouted back, standing up. It is choice I am choosing to fight. Hey! Rook slammed a tray of metal baking sheets onto the floor. The crash was deafening. Enough! Rook yelled, all forearms raised. You are both idiots. Look at the window. They looked. Outside on the street level, a group of people were gathering. It wasn't a mob. It was a vigil. Humans, Faliri Centaurians, Lithivores. They were standing outside the closed shop holding candles and glow sticks. Someone had taped a sign to the glass, "We believe the cat." The city is not against you, Rook said, his voice unusually serious. Arden is loud, yes. Hate is loud. But look at that. You saved them. They know it. You think hiding in here, letting the bad guy win, is protecting them? No. The only way to protect them is to finish what you started. Jim walked to the window. He looked at the faces outside. He saw a human woman holding a sign that said Pilots for Truth. He saw a Faliri child holding a drawing that looked suspiciously like Mira's a cat and a pilot saving the world. He felt the fear in his gut, the old cold fear of losing everything. But then he felt the bond. Betty was standing right behind him. She wasn't pushing him. She was just there, a warm, steady presence. I am scared, Jim admitted quietly. Good, Betty said, stepping up beside him. Only crazy people aren't scared. Are you crazy, Jim? I accepted a friend request from a cat. Jim smiled weakly. So, probably, he turned to Yara. What is the plan? The plan was, in technical terms, a disaster waiting to happen. It was 2:00 in the morning when the side door of Nebula Brew opened. The crowd had dispersed, driven away by the biting wind. Mira stays with Rook, Jim said, kneeling down to hug his daughter. Rook is going to take you to his hive cousin's house in the lower levels. It is safe there. Nobody looks for anyone in the pastry district. I want to help, Mira whispered, clinging to his neck. You are helping, Betty said, crouching down beside them. You are the backup generator. You keep the hope running while we do the heavy lifting. She handed Mira a small, golden pin, her manager's badge. You are in charge of the staff until I get back. Do not let Rook eat all the profits. Mira giggled through her tears, pinning the badge to her shirt. Okay, come back soon, both of you. We will, Jim promised. He watched Rook and Mira disappear into the shadows of the alley. Then he turned to Betty. Ready to be a criminal? He asked. I have been overcharging for almond milk for years, Betty smirked, though her hands were shaking. I am already a criminal. Let's go. Captain Yara had provided them with a maintenance access code for the ventilation shafts of the central spire. It was a tight squeeze, dirty, and smelled of recycled air. They moved in silence for an hour, climbing higher and higher into the belly of the beast. The bond between them was wide open now. They didn't need to speak. Jim knew when Betty needed a hand up a steep ledge. Betty knew when Jim's knee was hurting from the climb and slowed down without asking. They reached the service hatch overlooking the atrium of the Nexus. It was a massive circular chamber. In the center, suspended in a magnetic field, was the lumen core itself, a blindingly bright sphere of pure energy, pulsing like a star. Around it, a ring of consoles and terminals hummed with activity, and between them and the core were 6 high guards armed with pulse rifles. 6, Jim whispered, peering through the grate. We can't take 6. We don't have to fight them, Betty whispered back. We just need a distraction. I left my juggling balls at home, Jim quipped nervously. I am serious. The core reacts to emotion, right? To the bond. Betty looked at him. Her eyes were reflecting the light of the core below. If we push enough energy through the link, raw, chaotic emotional energy, the core will flare. It will trigger a sensory overload in the room. The guards will be blinded for a few seconds. That is our window. Raw emotion, Jim said. Like what fear? No. Betty shook her head. She moved closer to him in the cramped shaft. The space was so small, their breaths mingled. Fear shuts the core down. We need something that opens it up. Something volatile. Something passionate. Jim looked at her. In the dim light, with dirt on her cheek and her fur matted, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He realized with a sudden terrifying clarity that he wasn't just doing this for the city. He wasn't even doing it just for Mira. He was doing it because a world without this sarcastic, brave, impossible Faliri was not a world he wanted to live in. Passionate, Jim repeated. His voice dropped an octave. Jim, Betty breathed. She could feel his emotions flooding across the bond. It was like a dam breaking. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't gratitude. It was love. Deep, terrifying, reckless love. I think, Jim whispered, reaching out to cup her face, his thumb, tracing the line of her whiskers. I can manage that. He leaned in. It wasn't a movie kiss. It was desperate. It was the collision of 2 lonely stars. When his lips met hers, the bond didn't just hum. It screamed. Flash. Below them, the lumen core roared. A wave of golden light erupted from the sphere, filling the Nexus chamber with blinding radiance. Visuals down, a guard shouted below. Sensors are white out. What is happening? Now, Betty pulled away, breathless, her eyes glowing like twin suns. Jim kicked the grate open. They dropped into the light. They hit the floor, running. The guards were staggering, shielding their eyes from the sudden flare. Jim tackled the nearest one, using his pilot's momentum to knock the heavy alien aside. Go, Jim shouted, grabbing a discarded pulse rifle and firing a warning shot at the ceiling to keep the others back. Get to the terminal, Betty sprinted toward the central console. She vaulted over a railing landing in front of the master interface. Halt! A guard shouted, raising his weapon blindly. Betty didn't stop. She slammed her hand onto the bioscanner. Identity confirmed. Warden Betty. Access granted. The terminal lit up green. Yara was right, Betty muttered, her fingers flying across the holographic keyboard. Accessing root directory, searching for authorized scripts. Betty, Jim yelled. He was taking cover behind a pillar as plasma bolts began to sizzle through the air. The guards were recovering. I could use some of that magic right now. Almost there, Betty shouted. I found it, Project Discord. Ardan's signature is all over it. He scheduled the pylon failure 3 months ago. Great, download it, and let's get out of here. I am trying, the file is huge. A plasma bolt clipped the pillar next to Jim, showering him in sparks. Betty, I am pinned down, we have company. More doors were opening. Reinforcements. Betty looked at the download bar, 70%. She looked at Jim. He was outnumbered. He was going to get overrun in seconds. She made a choice. Core, Betty screamed, turning her back on the terminal and facing the great sphere of light. Listen to me. She didn't use the console. She used the voice. You know the truth, you felt him, you felt us. She threw her arms out. She grabbed the energy of the core, not a trickle this time, but a river. She channeled it, not into a shield, but into the terminal itself. Upload. She forced the data out, not to a drive, to the city. Broadcast, she commanded. Broadcast initiated. Every screen in the Nexus, every screen in the Council building, every screen in Celestia Harbor suddenly lit up. The file didn't just download, it played. Arden's voice, recorded in a private memo, boomed through the speakers of the entire city. Humans are the weak link. Break the pylon. Blame the pilot. The city will be ours again. The guards in the room froze. They lowered their weapons. They looked at the screens, then at each other. The silence was absolute. Download complete. Betty slumped against the console. Gotcha, she whispered. Then the doors to the Nexus blew open. It wasn't Arden's men. It was Arden himself. He stood in the doorway surrounded by a dozen mercenaries, wearing unmarked black armor. He wasn't wearing his counselor robes. He was wearing a combat suit. And in his hand, he held a device that looked suspiciously like a detonator. You possessive little stray, Arden sneered, his crystalline face twisted into a mask of pure hate. You think a broadcast stops me? I have backups. I have contingencies. He raised the device. If I cannot rule this city, Arden said softly, then no one flies it. He pressed the button. Nothing exploded. Instead, a low grinding sound echoed from deep, deep beneath their feet. It sounded like the earth splitting open. The lumen core turned red. What did you do? Jim shouted, stepping out from cover, his rifle aimed at Arden. I just released the magnetic locks on the core, Arden smiled. In 5 minutes, the containment field fails. The core will go critical. Celestia Harbor will not just fall pilot. It will vaporize. He threw the detonator to the floor and stepped back as his mercenaries raised their weapons. Run while you can, Arden laughed, or stay and burn together. Jim looked at the red, pulsing sun in the center of the room. He looked at Betty. The political fight was over. The fight for survival had just begun. 5 minutes, Jim said, his voice steady. He reached out and took Betty's hand. The Bond was singing a frantic, desperate song, but underneath it there was steel. We fixed a pylon, Betty said, baring her teeth at the glowing red orb. We can fix a light bulb. This is a really big light bulb, Jim noted. Then we are going to need a really big wrench, Betty said. She turned to the core. Let's go to work, partner. The heavy blast doors of the Lumen Nexus did not open with a digital hiss. They groaned, the sound of ancient, unlubricated metal, grinding against stone, echoing through the vast subterranean chamber. It sounded less like a door opening, and more like a mountain clearing its throat. Jim Thorne stood with his rifle raised, his breath misting in the sudden drop in temperature. Beside him, Betty lowered her hand from the biometric scanner. The golden light in her eyes faded to a simmer, leaving her looking exhausted, but terrifyingly focused. Welcome to the basement, Betty whispered. The Nexus was not the sterile, white-walled server room Jim had expected. It was a cathedral of machinery. Massive brass gears, each the size of a cargo hauler, turned in a slow, rhythmic dance along the walls. Pipes, thick as tree trunks, pulsed with glowing blue fluid, pumping the lifeblood of the city into the chaotic, swirling sphere of energy suspended in the center of the room. The lumen core. It was red now. The angry crimson light bathed the room in the color of a warning sign. The air tasted of copper and static electricity. "It is mechanical," Jim said, lowering his weapon slightly, his pilot's brain instantly trying to make sense of the engineering. "I thought it was all energy fields and crystals, but this is an engine, a combustion engine for a star." "The first builders knew that energy needs a cage," Betty explained, stepping onto the metal walkway that bridged the abyss toward the central console. "The Faliri provided the spark. The humans built the engine to hold it. That was the first pact." They ran toward the center. The countdown Ardan had triggered was invisible, but Jim could feel it in the vibrations of the floor. The gears were spinning faster. The hum of the core was rising in pitch, approaching a scream. "We have 4 minutes before critical mass," Jim estimated, looking at the pressure gauges on the nearest pipe. "If that pressure valve hits the red line, the containment field collapses. We turn into a supernova." "Then we have to work fast," Betty said. She reached the main control interface. It wasn't a keyboard. It was a series of stone dials and glass panels embedded with sensors that looked like handprints. She placed her hands on the glass. "Accessing," she murmured. "Show me the source." The room shuddered. A holographic projection sprang to life above the console, but it wasn't the neat, orderly rows of data they had seen earlier. It was a chaotic web of light, showing the history of every connection made to the core for the last 1,000 years. "I need to find the lockout command," Betty said, her eyes darting across the floating symbols. "Arden buried it deep. He used a legacy code." Jim stood guard, his eyes scanning the shadows of the massive gears. He felt useless. He was a man who fixed thrusters with a wrench. This was mystical programming beyond his pay grade. "Betty," Jim said, watching a pressure gauge tick upward. "Can I help, or should I just look menacing?" "You are helping," Betty said, her voice distracted. "Your presence stabilizes the field. The anchor weight." She froze. "What is it?" Jim asked, stepping closer. Betty swiped her hand through the hologram, isolating a specific strand of data. It was a golden thread, weaving through the history of the city like a vein of gold and quartz. "Jim," Betty said, looking up at him with wide eyes. "Look at this," she pointed to the hologram. The data stream resolved into an image. It was an old manifest dated 300 years ago. It was a list of the founding crew, the first pilots who had navigated the treacherous asteroid fields to bring the raw materials for the Lumen Core to Celestia Harbor. At the top of the list was a name, Commander Elias Thorne. Jim stared at the glowing letters. "Thorne. That is my last name. But Thorne is common. There are thousands of Thorns." "Not in the flight logs of the First Fleet," Betty said softly. She expanded the data. "The system has been tracking your genetic lineage for 10 generations. The Thorns have always been pilots, always haulers, always the ones who stayed behind to hold the line when others fled." She looked at him, and the realization hit Jim like a physical blow. "The anchor isn't just a mystical title," Betty explained, her voice filled with wonder. "It is a biological and psychological profile. The core doesn't just need a human. It needs a specific kind of human. Someone who understands weight. Someone who understands balance. Someone who protects." Jim looked at his hands, rough-scarred, stained with engine grease. He had spent his whole life thinking he was a failure because he was just a cargo pilot, not a glamorous explorer or a wealthy merchant. He thought he was bottom tier. "I am not special, Betty," Jim stammered. "I am just a guy who drives a truck in space." "Exactly," Betty smiled, and it was the warmest thing in that cold red room. "You carry the weight. That is what an anchor does." She turned back to the console. "And that brings us to the friend request." "What?" "The friend request." Betty tapped a new node on the screen. "You thought it was a joke. Mira thought it was a game. But look at the timestamp." Jim looked. The moment Mira had sent that request, and the moment Betty had accepted it, corresponded exactly to a massive spike in the core's energy reception. The ancient ritual for activating a warden anchor bond required a token of mutual consent, Betty read from the archaic file. In the old days, it was a blood oath or a shared artifact. But the core evolves. It learns. It watched the city's network. It saw a gesture of pure, unforced connection. "A sticker," Jim said, disbelief coloring his voice. "We saved the world with a sticker of a cat making a heart shape." "Intent matters more than the medium," Betty said, her tail twitching with amusement. "You reached out. I accepted. No politics, no coercion. Just two people acknowledging each other. That is the strongest magic there is." Clang. The sound of a heavy boot hitting metal echoed through the chamber. Jim spun around, raising his rifle. Emerging from the shadows of the gearworks was not Ardan Mirel, but a squad of his elite private security. And behind them, floating on a gravity disk, was the counselor himself. He looked disheveled, his translucent skin flushed with a sickly, purple hue of rage. "Touching," Ardan spat, his voice amplified by the acoustics of the chamber. "Truly touching. A history lesson while the city burns." "It is over, Ardan," Jim shouted, stepping in front of Betty. "We uploaded the logs. The whole city knows what you did." "The city knows what I tell them to know," Ardan screamed. He pressed a button on his wrist gauntlet. Around the room, the pressure valves on the pipes hissed. Steam erupted, scalding and white. The red light of the core intensified, pulsing faster. "I have accelerated the decay," Ardan announced, his eyes manic. "In 2 minutes, the core will emit a pulse that will wipe the memory banks of every computer in Celestia Harbor. No logs, no proof. And in the chaos, I will rebuild. And you two, you will be the tragic casualties of terrorist malfunctions." "You will kill everyone," Betty yelled, her hands gripping the console. "I will save them from their own mediocrity," Ardan retorted. "Kill them." The guards raised their weapons. "Jim, hold them off," Betty commanded, her voice dropping into the warden resonance. "I am going to end this." "How?" Jim fired a burst of plasma, forcing the guards to scatter behind the machinery. "You can't stop the pulse from here." "I am not going to stop it," Betty said, her eyes closing. "I am going to redirect it." She didn't type. She didn't swipe. She climbed onto the console. "What are you doing?" Jim shouted, ducking as a laser bolt singed his ear. "I am the warden," Betty said, spreading her arms wide. She didn't look at the guards. She looked straight at the angry, swirling sun of the core. "And I am filing a complaint with the management," Betty screamed. It wasn't a scream of fear. It was a scream of power. She unleashed the full force of her connection to the lumen. She didn't try to control the energy. She invited it in. She became a lightning rod. The core roared in response. A beam of solid white light erupted from the sphere and slammed into Betty's chest. "Betty!" Jim screamed, breaking cover to run to her. "Stay back." Betty's voice echoed, not from her mouth but from the air itself. Her body was dissolving into pure radiance. She was becoming a being of light. She raised one hand and pointed at the ceiling toward the massive ventilation shaft that led to the surface. "Skycast," she commanded. The beam of light shot upward, punching through the roof of the Nexus, up through the spine of the tower, and erupted out of the top of the council spire, like a beacon. Above, in the city, the night sky turned day. The clouds became screens. The mist became a canvas. Betty wasn't just showing logs anymore. She was showing memory. Every citizen in Celestia Harbor looked up. Projected against the stars in mile-high detail was the scene inside the Nexus. They saw Ardan's twisted face. They heard his voice. "I will save them from their own mediocrity." They saw the guards firing on a lone pilot. And they saw the data. Not just the text, but the visual proof of Ardan sabotaging the pylon, paying off the mercenaries, and rigging the elections. It was the ultimate transparency. In the Nexus, Ardan stared at the ceiling, watching his own treachery broadcast to the galaxy. His purple flush faded to a terrified gray. "No," he whispered. "Impossible." "You forgot one thing, Ardan," Jim said, walking forward. The guards had stopped shooting. They were looking at the ceiling, then at their employer, realizing they were on the wrong side of history and that their paychecks were about to bounce. Jim lowered his rifle. He didn't need it. "You forgot that this city was built by people who haul trash and serve coffee," Jim said. "We know how to clean up a mess." The gears groaned. The core was stabilizing the red light, fading back to a gentle golden hum. Betty collapsed on the console, the light fading from her body, leaving her shivering and smoking slightly. Jim was there in a second, catching her before she slid to the floor. "I think I voided the warranty," Betty wheezed, her fur singed at the edges. "You did good, partner," Jim whispered, holding her tight. Arden fell to his knees. The guards were already backing away, dropping their weapons. From the elevator shaft, the sound of heavy boots approached Captain Yara and the Loyalist High Guard, coming to take out the trash. Jim looked at Betty. She was exhausted, battered, and smelled like burnt ozone. "You know," Jim said, brushing a flake of soot from her nose. "This is a terrible first date." Betty let out a weak, raspy laugh. "I don't know. The lighting was dramatic." The aftermath of the Lumen crisis, as the historians would later call it, was less of a political maneuvering and more of a landslide. With Ardan's confession, broadcast in 4K resolution to the entire sector, his trial was the shortest in council history. He was sentenced to rehabilitation on a mining colony, where he would have plenty of time to contemplate the value of manual labor. The council itself underwent a rapid and aggressive restructuring. The public outcry was deafening. They demanded transparency. They demanded representation for the lower species. And most loudly, they demanded that the cat and the pilot be given the keys to the city. 3 weeks later, in the Grand Hall of the High Council, a ceremony was held. Betty stood on the podium. She was wearing a formal robe of deep blue velvet, embroidered with the golden sigil of the warden. It was elegant, regal, and she hated it. It itched. Next to her stood Jim. He had refused the ceremonial robes. Instead, he wore a crisp new flight suit with the Transport Guild insignia polished to a shine. On his shoulder, he wore a new patch, a golden anchor. "Citizens," the new head counselor spoke to the assembled crowd. "We stand here today to honor the pact that saved us. We offer the title of High Warden to Betty of the Faliri." The crowd cheered. "And," the counselor continued, looking slightly less enthusiastic, but resigned to the inevitable, "we offer the position of Master of Logistics and Lumen Stability to Captain James Thorne." The cheer was louder this time, mostly because the Transport Guild had parked 50 ships outside the window and were blasting their horns. "Do you accept?" the counselor asked. Betty looked at the microphone. She looked at the council members who were watching her, with a mix of respect and fear. Then she looked at the camera drone hovering nearby. "We accept," Betty said, her voice clear. "But with conditions." A murmur went through the room. "Condition 1, Betty held up a clawed finger. "The Lumen Core is no longer a state secret. Its status will be broadcast daily. No more hiding instability." "Agreed," the counselor nodded. "Condition 2, Betty raised a second finger. "The Deathworlder classification for humans and other new species is abolished. If you can work here, you belong here." "Agreed," the counselor said, wiping sweat from his brow. "And Condition 3, Jim leaned into the mic, grinning. "The docking fees for independent haulers are reduced by 50%, and free coffee for all maintenance workers on Tuesdays." The counselor looked pained. 50% is significant. "So is gravity," Jim shrugged. "Agreed," the counselor sighed. The gavel banged. It was done. 6 months later. Nebula Brew was busier than ever. The closed for repairs sign had been replaced by a neon holographic sign that read, "Nebula Brew, home of the Guardians and really good muffins." The shop had been expanded. The shattered window was now a massive reinforced observation deck. The espresso machine was a new, top-of-the-line model that hummed rather than screamed. Betty stood behind the counter, steaming milk. She was wearing her warden robes, but she had tied the sleeves back and put her favorite grease-stained apron over them. "Order up," she called out. "Double-shot mocha for the gentleman with the tentacles." Rook was in the back, commanding a small army of assistant bakers. He was currently experimenting with a cake that levitated. The bell chimed. Jim walked in. He wasn't wearing his flight suit today. He was wearing casual clothes, a soft sweater, and jeans. He looked rested. The dark circles under his eyes were gone. "Hey, boss," Jim said, leaning on the counter. "Table for two. I hear the service here is terrible, but the manager is cute." "The manager is busy running a city," Betty retorted, though she immediately abandoned the milk pitcher to lean toward him. "Did you finish the inspection of the south pylon?" "All clear," Jim said. "Structural integrity is at 100%. The new dampeners are working like a charm. And I found a loose bolt, so I tightened it. You are welcome." "My hero," Betty deadpanned, but her tail curled around his wrist, a gesture of affection she no longer bothered to hide. "Dad, Betty." Mira came bounding down the spiral staircase from the upper loft. She was wearing a school uniform, but she had customized it with a badge that said Junior Warden. "Guess what?" Mira shouted, slamming her datapad on the counter. "I got an A on my history project, the one about the first builders." "That is amazing, Gremlin," Jim beamed, picking her up. "What did the teacher say?" "She said I had an unfair advantage because I live with the primary sources," Mira giggled. Then she looked at them both with a sly expression. "Also, Tommy asked if you guys are going to get married. I told him you are already bonded, which is like marriage, but with more glowing lights and less cake. Was I right?" Jim choked on his own breath. His face turned a bright tomato red. Betty froze. Her ears swiveled back. She looked at Jim, who was frantically trying to find something interesting to look at on the ceiling. "Mira," Betty said, her voice dangerous, but her eyes dancing with amusement. "Go help Rook with the levitating cake before it floats out the window." "Okay," Mira chirped, hopping down. She paused at the kitchen door. "But seriously, I want cake." She disappeared into the kitchen. Jim cleared his throat. "Kids, they say the darndest things." "Bonded," Betty mused, tapping her chin. "It is a strong word." "It is accurate," Jim said, his voice lowering. He reached out and took her hand. The connection between them was always there now, a warm, golden hum in the back of their minds. It wasn't intrusive anymore. It was comfortable. It felt like coming home. "You know," Jim said softly, "I never thought I would find this. Not after Sarah. I thought my flight plan was just a straight line to the end. Alone." "You were never alone, Jim," Betty said, squeezing his hand. "You just needed a co-pilot." She leaned over the counter. He leaned in. The kiss was short, sweet, and tasted faintly of coffee and ozone. Outside the window, the city of Celestia Harbor glittered in the twilight. Ships moved in perfect rhythm, guided by a system that was finely balanced. The lumen core pulsed deep below a steady, healthy heartbeat. Betty pulled back, smiling. Her wrist terminal chimed. She looked down. It wasn't a crisis alert. It wasn't a council summons. It was a notification from Citizen Link. Anniversary, alert 1 year since connection. Status primary, bonded guardians of Celestia Harbor. Bond integrity, 100% message from system. Happy anniversary. Betty laughed. She turned the screen to show Jim. "Look at that," she said. "The system remembered." Technically, Jim grinned, pulling out his own datapad. "I remembered first." He tapped a button. On Betty's screen, a new message popped up. User James Jim Thorne sent a message. It was an emoji. A simple, pixelated cup of coffee with a heart rising from the steam. Betty rolled her eyes, but her heart did a somersault. She tapped to reply. User Betty sent a message. A rocket ship, and a cat hugging it. You are a sapthorn, Betty said. And you love it, Jim replied. Betty looked out at the city they had saved, then back at the man and the little girl in the kitchen who had saved her. Yeah, Betty whispered, her tail intertwining with his fingers. I really do. She turned off the terminal. The notifications could wait. The council could wait. Rook, she shouted toward the kitchen. Cut the cake, we are celebrating. As laughter erupted from the back room, the camera pulled back out through the window of Nebula Brew, rising higher and higher into the evening sky. It drifted past the gleaming towers, past the steady streams of traffic up to the very top of the spire, where the lumen beam touched the stars. The city was safe, the coffee was hot, and the universe for once was exactly where it was supposed to be.